On June 4th, 1935, at exactly 2:17 in the afternoon, Eddie "Trigger" Malone walked into the Red Rooster Bar on Lenox Avenue with one mission: kill Bumpy Johnson. By 2:40 that same afternoon, Eddie Malone would be lying in the middle of 135th Street, unable to move, surrounded by a growing crowd that would watch him die over the next 13 hours. But this wasn't murder, this was education, and every person in Harlem that day learned a lesson they would never forget. NYPD declassified files from 1935 contain 47 witness statements, crime scene photographs, and medical examiner reports that piece together what actually happened. More importantly, they reveal why it happened the way it did. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't just survive an assassination attempt, he transformed it into the most effective deterrent message ever sent in the Harlem underworld. This is Case File No. 7, The Strategic Anatomy of Deterrence by Example. To understand why Eddie Malone made his fatal mistake, we must first understand the Harlem of mid-1935. The Great Depression was entering its 6th year. Unemployment in Harlem exceeded 60%. For thousands of African Americans who had migrated north during the Great Migration, the Promised Land had become a daily struggle for survival, and in that environment of desperation, one industry thrived: the numbers racket. The numbers game was simple. You bet a nickel, a dime, a quarter on a 3-digit number. If your number hit, determined by the last 3 digits of that day's total betting handle at a designated racetrack, you won 600 times your bet. A nickel could become $30, a quarter could mean $150. In a community where the average weekly wage was $12, the numbers racket wasn't just gambling, it was hope in numerical form. By 1935, the Harlem numbers racket generated approximately $15 million annually. That's roughly $300 million in today's money. And the man who controlled the largest piece of that empire was Bumpy Johnson, 30 years old, recently released from his 2nd prison term, and already recognized as the most strategically sophisticated operator in Harlem. But Bumpy's control was being challenged. Dutch Schultz, the violent and unpredictable white gangster who controlled beer distribution throughout the Bronx, had decided to take over Harlem's numbers. Dutch's method was simple: overwhelming violence. Between January and May of 1935, Dutch's men had killed 17 numbers runners, bombed 6 policy banks, and terrorized dozens of operators into submission. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, Bumpy's mentor, and the legendary numbers queen had already retreated to hiding. Most independent operators had surrendered. Bumpy Johnson refused. On May 15, 1935, Bumpy sent Dutch Schultz a message through intermediaries. The message was simple: Harlem is not for sale. Come try to take it yourself if you want it. Dutch Schultz, who had built his reputation on personal brutality, on beating men to death with his own fists, took this as a personal insult, and Dutch Schultz did not tolerate insults. Eddie "Trigger" Malone was 28 years old, Irish, a product of Hell's Kitchen and one of Dutch Schultz's most reliable killers. Police files showed Eddie had been arrested 9 times for assault, twice for murder, and never convicted. Witnesses were too afraid to testify. Eddie's specialty was close-range killing. He didn't use rifles or long guns. He used a snub-nosed .38 revolver, got within 10 feet of his target, and fired until the gun was empty. Simple, brutal, effective. Dutch Schultz offered Eddie $500 to kill Bumpy Johnson. That's nearly $10,000 in current value. For Eddie, this was just another job. He had killed 17 men by his own admission. He had no reason to believe Bumpy Johnson would be different. Eddie made his first critical mistake on June 3rd, the day before the attempt. He spent the afternoon drinking in a speakeasy on West 146th Street, bragging to other Irish gangsters about the big job he had the next day. He never mentioned Bumpy's name, but he said enough. One of the men drinking that afternoon was on Bumpy's payroll. By 6 o'clock that evening, Bumpy Johnson knew someone was coming for him. He didn't know who or when, but he knew. This is where Bumpy's intelligence network becomes crucial to understanding the event. Bumpy didn't just run numbers, he ran information. He had paid informants in every bar, every speakeasy, every rooming house in Harlem and the surrounding neighborhoods. He had Irish informants, Italian informants, Jewish informants, corrupt cops, bartenders, prostitutes, janitors. People you'd never suspect, and these people told Bumpy everything because Bumpy paid well and protected better. When Bumpy received the warning on June 3rd, he didn't hide. He didn't change his routine. He didn't even increase his security. Instead, he did something that seems insane until you understand his strategy. He made himself more visible. On the morning of June 4th, Bumpy Johnson was seen having breakfast at the Red Rooster, the most popular restaurant in Harlem. He sat at his usual table near the front window, visible from the street. He was alone, except for one bodyguard standing at the bar. Witness statements describe Bumpy that morning as relaxed, almost cheerful. He ate slowly, read the newspaper, exchanged pleasantries with other diners. He stayed at that table for nearly 3 hours. It was as if he was waiting for something, because he was. Eddie Malone arrived at the Red Rooster at 2:17 in the afternoon. Multiple witnesses saw him enter. He wore a dark suit, fedora pulled low, right hand in his coat pocket, the classic killer's posture. Eddie scanned the restaurant, spotted Bumpy at the window table, and started walking toward him. Here's what the witnesses didn't see, but what we can reconstruct from Bumpy's later notes and subsequent events. Bumpy had been watching Eddie through the reflection in the window glass. He had identified the threat before Eddie took 3 steps into the restaurant. And in those seconds, Bumpy Johnson made a calculation that would define the next 13 hours. Bumpy could have signaled his bodyguard. The bodyguard, a man named Luther Big Boy Washington, was 6 feet 4 inches, 260 pounds, and carrying a .45 automatic. Eddie would have been dead before he cleared his revolver. But that would have been just another killing. Another body, another forgotten corpse. Bumpy wanted something different. He wanted a lesson that Harlem would remember. As Eddie approached, Bumpy slowly stood up. He kept his hands visible, palms open. He smiled. Witnesses remembered that smile. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was something worse. It was anticipation. Eddie Malone pulled the .38 revolver from his coat pocket when he was approximately 8 feet from Bumpy. He raised the gun, aimed at Bumpy's chest, and fired. The bullet missed, not because Eddie was a bad shot, but because Bumpy moved. In the exact microsecond between Eddie's finger tightening on the trigger and the hammer falling, Bumpy shifted his weight and turned his torso. The bullet passed through the space where his heart had been 1/10 of a second earlier and shattered the window behind him. Eddie fired again. Bumpy dove left, using the table for cover. The second bullet struck the wall. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Customers screamed, dove under tables, ran for the exits. Eddie fired a third shot, fourth, fifth. Glass shattered, wood splintered. But Bumpy Johnson was no longer where Eddie expected him to be. What happened next is documented in 17 separate witness statements, and they all agree on the essential facts. As Eddie's gun clicked empty, 6 shots fired, 0 hits, Bumpy Johnson emerged from behind the overturned table. He was holding a blackjack, a leather-wrapped lead weight used by police and criminals alike, and he was moving toward Eddie. Eddie tried to reload. His hands fumbled with the revolver's cylinder, dumping spent shells onto the floor. He never finished. Bumpy covered the distance between them in less than 2 seconds. The blackjack struck Eddie's right wrist with surgical precision. The sound of bones breaking was audible even over the screaming. The revolver clattered to the floor. Eddie's gun hand hung at an unnatural angle. Eddie Malone, to his credit, didn't surrender. He swung his left fist at Bumpy's head. Bumpy ducked under the punch and drove the blackjack into Eddie's left knee. Eddie collapsed, screaming. But Bumpy wasn't finished. He systematically, methodically broke Eddie's other wrist, then his other knee. 4 strikes, 4 broken limbs. Eddie Malone lay on the floor of the Red Rooster, conscious, in agony, and completely helpless. And then Bumpy Johnson did something that shocked everyone present. He dragged Eddie Malone out into the street. At 2:40 in the afternoon, on June 4th, 1935, Bumpy Johnson pulled Eddie Malone's broken body into the middle of the intersection of Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, the busiest intersection in Harlem. He laid Eddie flat on his back in the center of the crosswalk. Then Bumpy stood over him and spoke loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "This man came to kill me. Dutch Schultz sent him. Dutch thinks he can take Harlem with hired guns. But Harlem doesn't belong to Dutch. Harlem belongs to us, and this is what happens to anyone who comes here to kill one of us." So. Then Bumpy Johnson walked away. He didn't kill Eddie Malone. He left him alive, broken, and displayed in the middle of the street like a wounded animal. And here's the critical strategic element. Bumpy made sure nobody helped Eddie. Big Boy Washington, Bumpy's bodyguard, stood at the corner of 135th Street. Another of Bumpy's men appeared at the opposite corner. They didn't threaten anyone. They didn't need to. Their presence sent the message: if you help this man, you're choosing Dutch Schultz over Bumpy Johnson. And in June of 1935, with Dutch's terror campaign fresh in everyone's mind, that was not a choice anyone wanted to make publicly. For the first hour, Eddie Malone screamed. Witnesses described the sound as inhuman, an endless wail of pain that echoed off the brownstone buildings. People gathered on the sidewalks, watching from windows, standing in doorways. The crowd grew to over 100 people, but nobody crossed the street to help. Traffic rerouted around Eddie's body. Cars slowed, drivers looked, then continued. Some pedestrians stepped around him, most crossed to the opposite sidewalk. And Eddie Malone lay there, unable to move, both arms and both legs shattered, begging for help that never came. At 3:30, 1 hour and 10 minutes after Bumpy had dragged Eddie into the street, 2 uniformed NYPD officers arrived. Officers Patrick O'Donnell and James McCarthy, both Irish, both likely aware of Dutch Schultz's reputation. They stood over Eddie Malone's body and had a conversation that multiple witnesses overheard. O'Donnell asked McCarthy, "Should we call an ambulance?" McCarthy looked around at the watching crowd, then at the 2 large black men standing at the corners. He shook his head. "This is Bumpy Johnson's territory. This is his problem." They walked away. They filed a report describing a disturbance, but took no action. The police abandoned Eddie Malone just like everyone else. By 4 o'clock, Eddie had stopped screaming. Not because the pain had decreased, but because his voice was gone. He made weak, croaking sounds. His breathing was rapid and shallow. Medical examiner reports would later note that Eddie was likely going into shock from pain and blood loss. Both his wrists were bleeding where bone had punctured skin. His knees were swelling to grotesque sizes. And still, Bumpy's men stood watch, ensuring the lesson continued. At 5 o'clock, a white woman tried to help. Witnesses identified her as Mrs. Helen Morrison, a nurse who worked at Harlem Hospital. She approached with a medical bag, intending to at least stop the bleeding. Big Boy Washington stepped in front of her. He didn't touch her. He simply said, "Ma'am, Bumpy Johnson says this man stays where he is. You can walk away, or you can stay here with him. Your choice." Mrs. Morrison stood there for almost 10 minutes, crying before she walked away. Her testimony to police described this as the hardest decision of her life, but she walked away. As the sun began to set around 7:30, the crowd had grown to nearly 300 people. Word had spread throughout Harlem. People came to see the man who tried to kill Bumpy Johnson. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Others came because Bumpy's message was clear. This is the price of challenging me. Bring your friends, bring your family, watch, learn, remember. Eddie Malone was conscious for most of this. Witnesses described his eyes moving, following people, silently pleading. But he could no longer speak. His body had shut down everything except the essential functions needed to keep him alive. And those functions were failing. At 9 o'clock, as darkness fell completely, someone brought kerosene lanterns and placed them around Eddie's body. The display continued. The lesson continued. Bumpy Johnson wanted this visible after dark. By midnight, 8 hours after being dragged into the street, Eddie Malone's breathing had become irregular, long gaps between breaths. His skin had turned grayish. He was dying slowly, in front of hundreds of witnesses, and still nobody intervened. At 2 in the morning, 10 hours after the assassination attempt, a priest arrived. Father Michael O'Brien from St. Charles Borromeo Church, an Irish Catholic church serving Hell's Kitchen's overflow population in Harlem. Father O'Brien knelt beside Eddie and began administering last rites. Bumpy's men didn't stop him. Religious mercy was acceptable. Medical mercy was not. Father O'Brien's testimony described Eddie Malone as barely conscious, unable to speak or respond, eyes open but unseeing. The priest stayed with Eddie for 30 minutes praying, then left. He told police later that he believed Eddie was beyond saving and that moving him at that point would only hasten death by minutes rather than hours. At 4:30 in the morning, June 5, 1935, 14 hours after he had walked into the Red Rooster to kill Bumpy Johnson, Eddie "Trigger" Malone died in the intersection of Lenox Avenue and 135th Street. Cause of death: shock, blood loss, and exposure. He had been watched by hundreds of people, photographed by newspaper reporters, observed by police officers, and helped by no one. At 5 o'clock, as dawn broke over Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's men finally removed Eddie's body. They loaded it into the back of a truck and drove it to the morgue at Bellevue Hospital. Attached to Eddie's body was a note, handwritten by Bumpy, returned to Dutch Schultz with compliments. The strategic brilliance of what Bumpy Johnson did that day becomes clear when we examine the aftermath. This wasn't about killing Eddie Malone. Bumpy could have killed Eddie in the restaurant. He could have shot him, stabbed him, beaten him to death in seconds. Instead, Bumpy chose 13 hours of public suffering. Why? Because Bumpy understood something fundamental about deterrence. Fear is most effective when it's witnessed and remembered. A quick death is forgotten. A slow death becomes legend. Within 24 hours, every criminal operator in New York knew what had happened to Eddie Malone. Within 48 hours, Dutch Schultz knew, and Dutch's response is telling. He sent no more gunmen to Harlem. He attempted no revenge. He shifted his attention to other territories, because Dutch Schultz, for all his violence and unpredictability, understood the message. Taking Harlem from Bumpy Johnson would require a level of commitment and bloodshed that even Dutch found unacceptable. Bumpy's handwritten notes, found years later during a police raid, contain this entry dated June 5, 1935. Made example of Irish shooter. Necessary. 13 hours ensures 20 years of peace. Men will remember what they saw. They will tell their children. Fear of suffering exceeds fear of death. This is not cruelty. This is mathematics. This is the core of Bumpy Johnson's strategic philosophy. Every action calculated, every decision weighed. The 13 hours weren't sadism. They were investment. An investment in reputation that would pay dividends for decades. Consider the mathematics. 17 numbers runners had been killed in the 5 months before Eddie Malone's death. In the 5 months after, 0. Dutch Schultz's campaign to take Harlem ended completely, not because Bumpy killed all of Dutch's men, but because Bumpy made the cost of continuing too high. One death displayed correctly prevented hundreds more. The Harlem community's response is equally revealing. Police interviewed dozens of witnesses who had watched Eddie Malone die. Not one expressed sympathy for Eddie, not one condemned Bumpy. Their statements show a consistent theme. Eddie came to kill one of us, so we let him die. This is our neighborhood. This is our justice. Mrs. Ella Washington, a 56-year-old seamstress who watched from her window for all 13 hours, told police, "That white man came here to murder Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson protects this neighborhood. The police don't. Mr. Johnson does. So when Mr. Johnson said, 'Leave that man there,' we left him there. I'd do it again." Oh, this reveals the complex relationship between Bumpy Johnson and the Harlem community. Yes, Bumpy was a criminal. Yes, he profited from illegal gambling. But he also existed within a social structure where legal protection was unavailable to black citizens. The NYPD in 1935 was notoriously corrupt and racist. African Americans received no justice through legal channels. So they created their own justice, and Bumpy Johnson was the enforcer of that justice. The Eddie Malone incident established a principle that would govern Harlem's underworld for the next 30 years. Outside forces could not take Harlem by violence. Dutch Schultz learned this lesson. Lucky Luciano, who later attempted his own subtle takeover of Harlem's numbers, learned this lesson. The Italian mob families learned this lesson. They could negotiate with Bumpy. They could partner with Bumpy. They could not conquer Bumpy. Medical examiner reports provide additional insight into Bumpy's precision. Eddie Malone's injuries were severe, but not immediately fatal. Both wrists broken at the radius and ulna, both knees shattered at the patella and surrounding cartilage. But no damage to arteries, no damage to internal organs. Bumpy had broken Eddie's limbs in exactly the way required to incapacitate without killing quickly. This wasn't random violence. This was anatomical knowledge applied with blackjack accuracy. The psychological impact on potential future attackers cannot be overstated. Put yourself in the position of someone considering an attempt on Bumpy Johnson's life after June 4th, 1935. You know what happened to Eddie Malone. You know he lay in the street for 13 hours. You know hundreds of people watched and nobody helped. You know the police didn't help. You know a priest gave him last rites but couldn't save him. You know he died slowly, in agony as a public spectacle. Would you still take the contract? Would $500, $1,000, $5,000 be worth risking that fate? Most rational actors would say no. And that's exactly what Bumpy counted on. Dutch Schultz's biography confirms this. Arthur Flegenheimer, Dutch's real name, was interviewed by prosecutors in 1936, 1 year after Eddie's death. When asked why he abandoned his Harlem takeover, Dutch gave a rare moment of honesty. "Bumpy Johnson is crazy, but he's smart crazy. He doesn't just kill you, he makes you a lesson. I got plenty of territory, I don't need Harlem that bad." This from a man who had personally beaten rivals to death, who had ordered dozens of murders, who was known for irrational violence. Even Dutch Schultz found Bumpy's methods too extreme, too calculated, too effective. The strategic framework Bumpy employed is what modern military theorists call asymmetric deterrence. Bumpy couldn't match Dutch Schultz's resources. Dutch had more men, more guns, more money, but Bumpy had something Dutch lacked: complete control of his territory and the will to defend it with methods that exceeded his opponent's tolerance for consequences. Bumpy made the cost of victory higher than the value of the prize. That's asymmetric deterrence. But we must also examine the moral complexity of this event. 13 hours of public suffering. A man left to die in the street. A community that watched and did nothing. Was this justice? Was this defense? Was this terrorism? The answer is probably all three. Eddie Malone was not an innocent victim. He was a hired killer who came to Harlem specifically to commit murder. By the moral standards of the criminal underworld, he deserved retaliation. But the manner of retaliation exceeded even criminal norms. No code, no rules, no honor system included 13-hour public executions. Bumpy Johnson operated in a grey zone between community defense and brutal control. He protected Harlem from outside predators like Dutch Schultz, but he also used methods that traumatized his own community. Children watched a man die in the street. Families witnessed suffering. That trauma rippled through generations. Mrs. Clara Thompson, who was 12 years old in 1935 and witnessed Eddie Malone's death, was interviewed in 1998 at age 75. She said, "I understand now why Mr. Johnson did what he did, but I still have nightmares. I'm 75 years old and I still see that man's face, hear his screams. Some lessons are too harsh for children to learn." This is the cost of Bumpy's strategy. Yes, it worked. Yes, it protected Harlem from further invasion, but it also created collective trauma that lasted lifetimes. The police response, or lack thereof, reveals systemic racism that enabled Bumpy's action. If Eddie Malone had been left dying in the street in an Italian neighborhood, police would have intervened immediately. If this had happened in an Irish or Jewish neighborhood, ambulances would have been called. But because this happened in Harlem, because the victim was white and the perpetrator was black and operating in a black neighborhood, police allowed it to continue. The NYPD's 1935 internal investigation into Officers O'Donnell and McCarthy concluded with, "Officers exercised appropriate discretion in a dangerous situation. No disciplinary action warranted." In other words, the police officially sanctioned leaving a man to die in the street because intervening would have been dangerous. This institutional abandonment of Harlem created the vacuum that Bumpy Johnson filled. Legal authority didn't protect the community, so illegal authority did. And sometimes illegal authority used illegal methods that legal authority should have prevented, but didn't. Bumpy's relationship with violence is key to understanding this event. Unlike Dutch Schultz, who was violent by temperament, Bumpy was violent by calculation. Bumpy's prison records show he read extensively, particularly philosophy and military strategy. Sun Tzu's Art of War was found in his cell during multiple incarcerations. Machiavelli's The Prince was heavily annotated in his personal library. One particular passage from Bumpy's notes, dated 1942, 7 years after the Eddie Malone incident, reads, "Violence is the last tool of intelligent men, but when used, must be used so completely that it never needs to be used again. Fear, properly applied, is more valuable than force repeatedly applied." Eddie Malone's death bought a decade of peace. That is not cruelty. That is efficiency. This is Bumpy's worldview. Violence as instrument, not impulse. Suffering as message, not madness. But we must also acknowledge that this worldview requires a level of emotional detachment that borders on sociopathy. To drag a man into the street and watch him die over 13 hours requires shutting down normal human empathy. To plan this, to calculate the optimal duration of suffering for maximum deterrent effect, requires thinking of human beings as variables in an equation. Psychological profiles of Bumpy Johnson, compiled by prison psychiatrists during his later incarcerations, describe him as highly intelligent, emotionally controlled, capable of extreme violence without emotional response. One psychiatrist noted, "Subject discusses violence the way a chess player discusses strategy. He sees no moral dimension, only tactical considerations." This is who Bumpy Johnson was, not a hero, not purely a villain. A strategist who existed in a world where strategy required brutality. The long-term consequences of the Eddie Malone incident extended far beyond Dutch Schultz's retreat. This event established Bumpy's reputation as someone who didn't just win fights, but who turned opponents into object lessons. Future negotiations with the Italian mob, with corrupt politicians, with rival operators, all occurred in the shadow of Eddie Malone's death, when Lucky Luciano attempted to negotiate control of Harlem's numbers in 1936, 1 year after Eddie's death. The negotiation began with Luciano's representative saying, "Mr. Luciano wants peaceful partnership, not what happened to the Irish fellow." The Eddie Malone incident became shorthand for, "We know what you're capable of. Let's avoid that." This is strategic reputation in action. One event, properly executed and witnessed, shapes decades of future interactions. Frank Lucas, who would later become one of Harlem's most notorious drug dealers, was 9 years old in 1935. He witnessed the Eddie Malone incident from his apartment window. 40 years later, when interviewed by police following his own arrest, Frank Lucas said, "I learned everything I needed to know about power from watching Bumpy Johnson, not the killing, the teaching. Bumpy taught Harlem a lesson with that Irish shooter. Every white gangster who wanted Harlem had to walk past that intersection and remember what happened there." Malcolm X, who befriended Bumpy Johnson in the 1960s, asked Bumpy directly about the Eddie Malone incident during one of their conversations. Malcolm's autobiography includes this exchange. "Malcolm, I heard you let a man die in the street for 13 hours. That true?" Bumpy, "It's true." Malcolm, "You feel bad about it?" Bumpy, "I feel bad that it was necessary, but it was necessary. After Eddie Malone, no one tried to kill me for 20 years. 13 hours bought 20 years of peace. You do the math." This is Bumpy's consistent position: regret for necessity, but not regret for action. The media coverage of the Eddie Malone incident reveals the racial dynamics of 1930s America. White newspapers barely covered the story. The New York Times published a 3-sentence notice on page 19. "Man found dead in Harlem. Police investigating." The Daily News included a paragraph describing gang violence in Negro neighborhood, but black newspapers covered it extensively. The Amsterdam News, Harlem's primary African-American newspaper, ran a front-page story with the headline, "Harlem Defends Itself. Community Watchers Hired Killer Die." The article framed the incident not as criminal violence, but as community defense against white aggression. This framing is crucial. In the white press, Bumpy Johnson was a gangster who killed a man. In the black press, Bumpy Johnson was a defender who stopped an invasion. Both framings are partially true. Neither is complete. The truth exists in the complexity. Bumpy Johnson was both protector and predator. He defended Harlem from outside forces while simultaneously profiting from illegal gambling that exploited his own community. He prevented white gangsters from victimizing black citizens while running criminal operations that victimized those same citizens differently. This moral ambiguity is what makes Bumpy Johnson's story worth studying. He's not a simple villain. He's not a misunderstood hero. He's a product of systemic oppression who carved out power using the only tools available to him and used those tools with ruthless intelligence. By December 1935, 6 months after Eddie Malone's death, Dutch Schultz was himself murdered by the Italian mob for unrelated reasons. Dutch's death created a power vacuum in New York's underworld. Multiple families attempted to claim his territories, but none attempted to claim Harlem, because Harlem belonged to Bumpy Johnson, and everyone knew the price of challenging that claim. Bumpy would control Harlem's numbers for the next 30 years, through multiple prison terms, through challenges from the Italian mob, through the changing dynamics of the civil rights era. He died in 1968 at age 62 from a heart attack. He died free, powerful, and respected. Exactly as he had planned. The intersection of Lenox Avenue and 135th Street exists today. It's been repaved countless times. The buildings surrounding it have changed. The Red Rooster is long gone, but if you ask older Harlem residents about that corner, some still remember. Some still tell the story of the Irish shooter who tried to kill Bumpy Johnson and died slowly while the neighborhood watched. That's the power of strategic deterrence, not just stopping one threat, but creating a legend that prevents future threats. Bumpy Johnson understood this. He understood that reputation, properly cultivated, is more valuable than any weapon. The Eddie Malone incident wasn't the worst violence Bumpy Johnson committed. It probably wasn't even the most significant in terms of body count or political impact. But it was the most perfectly executed example of his core philosophy. Make one example so memorable that you never need to make another. And for 20 years after June 4th, 1935, it worked exactly as intended. We study this case not to glorify violence. We study it to understand how power operates in the absence of legal structures. We study it to see how strategic thinking can amplify limited resources into overwhelming deterrence. We study it to examine the moral complexity of community defense when the community has been abandoned by legal authority. Bumpy Johnson operated in a world where violence was the only language that crossed racial and ethnic barriers, where a black man had no legal recourse against white aggression, where survival required methods that would be unthinkable in a just society. He didn't create that world. He navigated it with intelligence that ensured his survival and, by extension, his community's autonomy. But survival came at a cost. Eddie Malone died in agony. A community was traumatized. Children witnessed horrors. And Bumpy Johnson became the kind of person who could watch a man die for 13 hours without flinching. Was it worth it? That depends on your perspective. If you're measuring by Bumpy's standards, by survival and territorial control, it was absolutely worth it. 13 hours bought 20 years of peace. That's strategic success. If you're measuring by moral standards, by human cost and collective trauma, the equation becomes much more complicated. Perhaps the final word should go to Bumpy Johnson himself, from notes found after his death. I am not a good man. I do not pretend to be. But I am a necessary man in an unjust world. I protect my people using the methods that work, not the methods that feel good. History can judge me. My people are alive to see that history. That's all that matters. On June 4th, 1935, Eddie "Trigger" Malone learned what it meant to threaten Bumpy Johnson, and for the next 20 years, everyone else in New York's underworld learned from Eddie's lesson without having to experience it themselves. That's the terrible efficiency of deterrence, by example. One man's suffering prevents 1,000 conflicts. One death prevents 100 deaths. The mathematics are clear even if the morality isn't. This is Case File. Wow 7. The strategic anatomy of how Bumpy Johnson transformed an assassination attempt into a 3-decade deterrent, not through superior firepower, but through superior strategic thinking, not through more violence, but through more calculated violence, not through fear alone, but through fear precisely calibrated and publicly displayed. The files are closed. The lessons remain open.